So welcome everybody to Save Our Schools Arizona's ongoing webinar series, Speaking of Schools. We tonight are talking about the new Jim Crow, school segregation via ESA vouchers. And I'm very excited to welcome our two panelists tonight. So let me just, a few logistics at the moment, and then we will hop right in. So for those of you who are listening, please feel free to put comments in the chat and I'll do my best to kind of work them into our discussion. And I hope that we'll have a little bit of time at the end. So over the past several years, school choice legislation has been introduced in dozens of states across the US. And most of these bills promote tax credit vouchers that pay tuition at private schools and education savings accounts, or what we in Arizona call empowerment scholarship accounts. All of these so-called school choice options drain public funds away from our already underfunded and under-resourced public schools and put that money into private schools and home schools and micro schools and other educational services. So proponents of these bills claim that they will improve educational opportunities, most especially for Black and Brown students and students from low-income families. But the fact is they do not. And in Arizona, we know that the majority of families using the new universal voucher program come from the wealthiest zip codes in our state, including Paradise Valley and Scottsdale. And our state is now spending upwards of $900 million to subsidize private school education. So what we're seeing in Arizona today is a continuation of the long history of vouchers perpetuating school segregation and systemic inequities and worsening the academic gap, most especially for our children of color. And so we're here today to talk about what we're calling the new Jim Crow, a reference to the Jim Crow laws of the late 19th and early 20th century that forced racial segregation. And so I want to talk about what you both think about the role of public education in a democracy, and then we'll sort of talk about the origin of vouchers, how they perpetuate segregation, and their impact on public education in communities across the United States. So that's the introduction. I am so excited and pleased to welcome our two panelists, Joann Mickens, the Executive Director of Parents for Public Schools, which is a national organization dedicated to advancing the role of families and communities in securing high quality public education for every child. So welcome, Joann. And Dountonia S, who is an education justice warrior who has engaged in numerous ways to fight for equitable public education for all children. And in addition to the many things that Dountonia does, she serves on the board of the Indiana Coalition of Public Education. And we at Save Our Schools Arizona have some very dear friends in Indiana at the Indiana Coalition for Public Education. So it's so nice to have you both here today. And I wanted to just give you each a chance to talk a little bit more about yourself and how public education became really a focus and a passion of your advocacy work. So Dountonia, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So I am a product of public schools, and I come from a long line of Mississippi educators. And so education has just been in my family, and it was an expectation. And it's just amazing as I look through the history of my family, the warriors for public education. So it's kind of a in my blood, but in the same breath, I was also the poster child for vouchers in the state of Indiana. Well, one of the poster children for vouchers. When I went through a divorce, I decided that I wanted my children to have a very specific biblical worldview from all perspectives, at home, at school, through their sports, everything. So I chose to send my children to private schools. Then a couple of years later, I got involved in I was the campaign manager for a public school board candidate, and it opened my eyes. At the time, I was a willing paying participant of private education. Then the law changed, which allowed me to become eligible for vouchers. And but for the fact that I was just getting a reprieve in my budget, I would have continued to pay for that private education throughout the time. But when I became the campaign manager for that school board candidate, it opened my eyes to what my choice that I was already making was doing to the students in my community, taking away resources for something that I was already funding in the first place. So I could no longer in good conscience continue to take vouchers, attempted to pay the vouchers back. And of course, the money never technically came into my hands. Therefore, I had nothing to pay back according to the state of Indiana, because I called all over the place. I even called the school, but the decision I made was to continue to support public education because I got a quality education in my public schools, and put my children in public schools after a certain point because they no longer served our purpose and they needed a more well-rounded education, period, from socially, academically, and also sports-wise, the opportunities that were there, not to mention the narrow viewpoint that my children were only going to be able to go into the military when my child professed that he wanted to become an engineer, and they didn't have the resources to support him. So I took my kids out of private schools. And so that's where it all started for me. And now I am everywhere trying to let everyone know that public schools are worth fighting for, not only for the preservation of our democracy, but for a well-informed populace, because now it seems like we've got parallel school systems that are funded by one pot of money, and we're creating a system of, we already had a system of the haves and the haves not, but now we have a system of workers and thinkers. And there are certain people who are choosing paths that will ensure that we have a workforce for those who are the intellectuals or the critical thinkers in our society. So I'll stop there and pass it along to Miss Joann to share her story.
Thank you.
Wow. It's fascinating listening to you. And I think Sharon's question is to tell us about me and how I got to become a public school advocate. And it's really a tale of two generations, because my generation is removed from yours. But when I think about when I started school in 1957 in a small town, a rural town in Virginia, Black kids, they established sort of like community schools for Black kids. And so the school I started my education in was the same school that my mom and her brothers and sisters had gone to. It was 3 rooms. There were 3 classes per room. There was no indoor plumbing. There was no central heat and air. And our teachers were fantastic. But on the other hand, you could see parallel to that, because keep in mind in 57, even though it's 3 years beyond Brown versus Board, Virginia still had segregated schools. And so our schools looked nothing like the schools where white kids attended. And so our schools, my house was closer to the white school than it was to our Black school. And yet we were not allowed to attend. And so it's really when I was in 2nd grade that Virginia said, okay, so we probably need to make this look a little bit more equal. And so that's when they built a new school, et cetera, et cetera. And so public education, public schools for me as a rural Black kid in Virginia opened up the world to me. And I loved school, I loved education, and I don't think that as American citizens, we should have to pay for education. It shouldn't be whether or not, if I can afford it, fine. Now I can choose to go to some very expensive academy, et cetera. But I do believe that fundamental to a democratic system of government such as we have, where the government is of and for and by the people, we have to have people who are prepared to participate in that government. And I think today we can see the problems that have arisen when we haven't, when we don't have a thinking populace, that we won't swallow so much misinformation, that we'll know our history, that we will know the impact of decisions, not only on me personally, but how it might be impacting others in the community. But to shorten my story, which goes back a long way, when I moved to Mississippi in the late 70s, I had every plan to send my kids to parochial schools. I didn't have any kids, but if I ever have kids, they're going to go to parochial schools because I want them to have Christian training. I think I sound a little bit like you. But when I moved here and I saw the attitude toward public schools, and when I saw the parallel school systems, and there is a parallel school system here, there was no way that my children were going to go anywhere except to public school. And so my children have gone to public schools. They both graduated from public schools in Jackson. I believe their education was excellent. My son was admitted to Syracuse University, my daughter to NYU, I think, and they didn't get, they scored, they succeeded. My son graduated with honors. My daughter was a presidential scholar. They were public school students. So it really bothers me when people assume that children cannot get a quality education in public schools. It is not true. It has never been true. And most of the people who are in positions of leadership in this country are public school graduates. That is where they receive their education. So to me, I have no, if you want to choose to send your child to a non-public school, that's fine. That's your choice. I think parents always choose what they believe is best for their children, as you indicated. But I don't believe that taxpayer dollars should be used to fund those choices. And I am adamantly against vouchers. I have Parents for Public Schools was established in Jackson in 1989. And at that time, my son was 10 years old. He was in 5th grade. And I became a member of Parents for Public Schools just as a parent many years ago, and began actually working for the organization in 2006. So I think that as we chip away at public schools, I think it's a situation where we won't miss the water until the well is dry. I think that we're doing everything we can to weaken this very vital institution. And I don't think that there is a real replacement for them at this time. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you both for sharing. Your stories are both fascinating. Appreciate your perspectives. You both touched a little bit on this, but I'd like to dig a little deeper into really what you see as the role of public education in a democracy. Who wants to take that first?
I see, well, I'll think about our American democracy. I think that sometimes we forget, as we fight about immigration and who's on the border, et cetera, I think that we forget that we're a nation of immigrants, and that the only folks here who are not immigrants, either forcibly or otherwise, are the Native Americans. And so we have, and so when we start comparing the United States to Finland or other countries that have much more homogeneous populations, it's an unfair comparison. I believe that it is absolutely essential that because of the nature of our population, we need to be intentional about bringing our population together, that there needs to be a place where we're interacting with people who represent the different aspects of America. And I think public education is a part of that. I think that we seem to have lost sight of the fact that we need to make an effort if this experiment in democracy is going to survive. We've got to make an effort to see how we can come together. How can we can have unity? Doesn't mean we have to agree, but it does mean that that's a problem when we're going into our separate corners and throwing harpoons out at one another. And so I think that one major aspect of why public education is so vital to a society like ours is that it brings us together. And on the other hand, I really do think it takes a level of thoughtfulness, an ability to think that is absolutely critical if we are going to govern ourselves. I think that we were hurt by the fact that we elected a leader for this country who has not a clue as to how our democracy works. And that's harmful, that's hurtful. And we've got a lot of other people who don't understand it and respect what a wonderful experiment this is. But I think that we must have, if not formally educated, because I, unlike, and I don't want to get your name, unlike my co-panelist, my father had a 4th grade education. My mother was a high school graduate. My father was one of the smartest, most capable people I've ever met. So it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily have a formal education in order to be a thoughtful person and one who can pull facts together. But I think in today's world, it's more essential than it's ever been. So I think I've taken the long way around, but I think public education is fundamental to this democracy, because we need a places where we come together and interact and get to know one another rather than standing apart and fearing one another or guessing about one another. And I think we also need a population that is thoughtful enough, educated enough to rule itself.
Yes, I ditto everything that Ms. Joann has stated. But in addition to that, it's important that we have an educated populace, and not necessarily formal, because I too had a very intelligent grandfather who couldn't read or write, but was very in pushed education because of the things. Well, he learned how to read and write. I was his tutor in the 4th grade. And so I just remember him going to the library to do that. And his motivation was so he could vote and understand who he was voting for, and what he was voting for, and be able to have some type of say-so in that. Education is power. And they say knowledge is power, but the application of knowledge is power. And we are living in a time where we have access to a lot of information without the critical ability to think and process and synthesize that information in a way that is responsible and ethical.
Yes. We
We are losing something when we are othering. And as my co-panelist was speaking, I couldn't help but I'm haunted by the question of why are we? Why one of the greatest things that we offer the world, because there are people from all around the world who want to come here to be educated.
Yes.
Why are we creating these barriers to equal or quality or accessible education? And when I think back to Brown versus Board and the panic around integrated schools, I can't help but to think the image of public education that so many of our elected officials were the benefactors of have promoted a message that it's been tainted because Black and Brown children now attend those institutions. And what is the fear of a unified America that we were promised in the whitewashed textbooks that we all grew up on? And so it just, it just bothers me that there are people out there who are making it more difficult by using the language of equity to create inequitable outcomes, so that we can't vote intelligently, so that we don't know our history, so we can't repeat it, which the things that are happening in Florida just confound me to no end. You know, just, it bothers me. And as those, you know, we're not that far removed from my grandfather being on the plantation. Now he's gone now, but still I'm a recipient of that knowledge and that history, that oral history that he passed down. I have a grandmother who lived to be 99. These are people who have memories of a time in our country that no longer exists. And as that generation continues to die out, and now that we have this interesting historical narrative that is now being promoted in our schools, it's worrisome that we're not going to have the country that we were taught to be proud of and to participate in, because even citizenship is not even something. Citizenship is, you know, partaking in the responsibilities to your neighbor and helping to make the country better, you know, making your communities better. That's going to be lost here soon if we continue down this polarized way of education.
Thank you. I love your distinction between knowledge is power and education is power. I think that's a really important distinction. I like that very much. So thank you. I mean, you're preaching to the choir to me. Share your sense of public education as really being a cornerstone of American democracy. I think we still have a big gap between realizing the ideal of what our public education system could be. I came across a book, which I haven't read. One of you may have, but I have recently ordered it. But it's a book-length study that examines the deep-rooted connection between today's school choice movement and the resistance to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So the author, Steve Suit's book is called Overturning Brown, the Segregationist Legacy of the Modern School Choice Movement. And I think one of the really important points that he makes is that some of the ways that the rationales that we give for vouchers today are the exact same rationales that were given for the segregation academies after Brown. So the idea that, we really need to have individual choice. Parents know what's best for their kids. Competition will be beneficial. This will lead to increased quality and more religious liberty. And, so I think those are very much the arguments, at least, that are often used here in Arizona. But I wonder if either of you might add to or give your thoughts on the kind of connections between the current school choice movement that's really gained momentum across the United States. Even just in the last year, we've seen the number of states that have ESA vouchers more than double. And some states are starting with universal vouchers, right? It took Arizona many, many years of this kind of incremental, systematic, increasing eligibility categories, moving toward universal, but some states are just like starting universal. Mm-hmm. So if you could talk a little bit about your sense of the connection between that segregationist past and what we see going on today. It's a big question, I know.
Yes, it is. And I can't wait to read that book. Right. The research that I've done, you could almost take a page from the historical arguments and just change the date in its exact same rhetoric. So I don't have much more to add than that, but this is an old argument that has now gotten momentum because we have media now that's able to distribute messages at a much more rapid rate nowadays. And we also have the backing of billionaires who have helped to move the process of school choice And I think that's the point. It's not new. This is something that has been in process ever since Brown versus Board passed. And so this effort to dismantle or to legally segregate has been going on for a long time. And I like to call it the school choice movement because parents have always had choices. Now it's just a matter of who pays for my choice.
Yep.
I like to call it voluntary segregation. We are choosing to segregate now, and the state is endorsing it. So state endorsed voluntary segregation. And so it's an old argument that, you know, it takes a long time to move an elephant because it was a good idea to integrate schools. And I think the reasoning for integration, which people often miss, was not that necessarily that, you know, African Americans wanted to go to school with white students, but it was more so they wanted access to quality that the white students were getting. And then there's a benefit, there's a residual benefit that came from that, is that, hey, we get to learn about one another. And we get to be in this place together, the unity that Miss Joann talked about. You're not so different than I am. We have the same issues. You may be rich, but you still are sad. You know, we learn from one another in that way, and it made us stronger. And there are glimpses of that strength, you know, in the historical context, and then it all unraveled because it's like, oh, something, power could be lost potentially, or whatever the other reasons, and we can't have that. It reminds me of Bacon's Rebellion. I mean, when when black and white servants slaves, indentured servants started to commingle, and there was strength in that, and they joined forces to overturn, you know, oh no, we need to now create this fiction of race, and here are the white people, and now you're white and it's black, and these tools of disunity that have consistently been woven throughout our American history is not new. And I hate to say it, it's that 1% wants to retain the power and control the people. Yeah. And that's what education does. It undoes that. It puts us on a level playing field. And if you're level with me, then you have the opportunity to rule over me. And the infrastructure that we've set up will not sustain someone from here ruling me up here, because I've always been here. So I hope that makes sense.
Well, thank you for that. I think so much of what you said is so important. But the one thing that I sort of caught on, at least toward the end of what you were saying, is that it's the 1%, it's the billionaires who are really pushing this school choice policy. We've definitely seen that in Arizona. It's the American Federation for Children, which is funded by the DeVos family. It's the Americans for Prosperity, funded by the Koch industries. And they are really pushing this policy in Arizona and across the country. But what we find on the ground in Arizona, when you just talk to people, everybody, like almost everybody, cares about their public school, loves their public school, is related to a public school teacher, has kids in public school. And even if they don't have kids in public school, they've been to some event at the public school down the street. And so the vast majority of people support and want to see our public schools fully funded and equitably funded. So yes, it's frustrating. Joann, what would you like to add?
Well, I will say that today, one difference I see today in the reasoning is I think the reasons are much more euphemistic. I think we use a lot of, I don't think the problem is with what goes on in our public schools. I think the problem is who's in them. I think it comes down, as most things in this country, it comes down to race and now, of course, as ethnicity. But it was made very clear, and keep in mind, I started school in the wake of Brown versus Board, and I live in Mississippi where the White Citizens Council established council schools. And they established white citizen council schools because they didn't want their white kids going to school with Black kids. It came down to race. And those schools, I was doing a little research because I didn't do Mississippi history, and I don't know if all this was in the history books or not. But the fact is the Mississippi legislature created something called tuition grants, the tuition grant law that allowed public dollars to go to fund white citizen council schools. So I think it was much more in your face and more blatant as to why or the problems. Now we talk about things like values and safety and all of that. I think we're dressing it up, but basically what we're saying is we don't want our children going to school with them. Or if our children are going to school with them, then we only want a few of them here. We want to control, we want a quota as to how many of them will be in the same space. And so to me, if you want your children going to those schools, fine. But I don't believe that my tax dollars, state, federal, city, whatever, should go to support that. And I saw a statistic that in Mississippi under the ESA voucher law that we have about each year a little over $4,000 per student for the public schools. The vouchers, it's $6,765 per student. Now, what sense does that make? And so we're trying to incentivize, entice groups of people away from the public schools and into private schools.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think it's exactly right that so much of this, really, we might talk in terms of complicated economic or sociological forces that have led to school segregation in this country. But I think, like you say, Joann, the root cause of the problem is pretty darn simple. And it's that white families don't want their kids going to school with Black kids. And that has been the case since schools were, since Brown versus Board, since schools were integrated. And I think one of the clearest indications of that is what we saw happen after Brown in Prince Edward County, Virginia, which is one of the early instances of, well, it was white people saying, no, we're not going to desegregate our schools. In fact, we're going to shut all of our schools, all of our public schools, and give everybody in Prince Edward County a voucher, because that would be fair. Everybody will get the same amount. But the problem was the private schools in Prince Edward County only allowed white kids to come, because private schools can discriminate still today. They get to say it's not school choice, it's the school's choice who they will allow to come into their schools. And, you know, it took many years, it took almost 5 years of the African-American families in that community having to either send their kids to another county, which just wasn't even an option for some families, or kind of trying to put together a school in a church basement or whatever to try anything they could do to educate their kids. But this was the same year, or a year or so after Brown, and then a year or so after Milton Friedman, the libertarian economist, wrote The Role of Government in Public Education. And he's the one who coined the phrase failing government schools, that's used in a derogatory way today still. And so I think this, you guys have both kind of touched on it a little bit, this kind of misinformation or tools of disunity, the way that we talk about public schools today is, or the way that people who want to dismantle public schools talk about public schools in such disparaging ways. So yeah, so I mean, if either of you want to add to that, but I also think it's complicated, right? Because we do have public schools that aren't doing right by some of our kids and are really struggling, and they are tremendously under-resourced. And so how do we kind of grapple with that complication?
Well, I'll comment on your example of Prince Edward County, because my county in Virginia, Nottoway, is one of the counties that abuts Prince Edward. And I was in elementary school, and we had kids from Prince Edward who came to Ingleside Elementary, and they just shut down the schools. I mean, it was absolutely, and of course gave money to white parents to support the school where their children went. That was just an aside. And of course, that means I have lost my train of thought as to what was your question again, because I thought that was such an interesting.
Just the misinformation, the way that we talk about public schools, but the fact that we also deal with public schools that really aren't doing right by our kids always. And so how do we kind of handle that or address
We got to admit that, but one way that we shouldn't deal with it is by pulling resources and funding away from them to give to a handful of parents whose kids are going to private schools. So to me, you know, if the largest percentage of your kids are over here, why pull money away from them to support the small niche of students? I think that one of the things we need to do is to make sure that our public schools are receiving the resources, the funding, the support they need. And we do, one of the things that really bothers me is that we, private schools can pick and choose. You know, this, even when Mississippi went to the vouchers, we went for children with disabilities. There were no, initially there was no requirement that these children received any kind of special education. It was, here's the money, they can go to this school. And of course, the peer report changed that, and they had to at least have some accountability. But the fact is, most of that money goes unused. And initially, the public schools were still working with the kids who were getting the vouchers to go to private schools. And so I think our schools need funding, adequate funding, so that we can have the quality and excellence across the board. And we got to, you know, I was talking to someone the other day. It's unfortunate that kids can't vote because because they can't vote. And that means that when their schools are falling apart, or they don't have the number of teachers they need, they can't boast the numbers of people who are in favor of fully funding schools to the extent that they should be. So they're taken advantage of. And of course, that leaves it to us adults to have the information we need in order to make the best decisions for the majority of our children.
Yeah, for me, it's not complicated. I know you said that it's complicated because there are indeed schools that are failing or not doing well, not performing. And that is, that's residual from Brown versus Board. Some of those schools were intentionally set up in order to fail, like in communities of abject poverty. I mean, you know, when the emphasis and the way schools are funded, you know, if there's no tax base, there's not going to be much funding there. But it always amazes me how still you can find success stories, even in schools that are set up to fail. With the least resources, in those communities, and it's amazing that some of those families choose that failing school to attend, not only because of legacy attendance by their families, because it's the closest school to their home. You know, it's not desirable to go travel across, but there are still some assets in those schools that have even been set up to fail. And we have to really recognize that the institution of our education system was not meant for Black and brown children anyway. And while we know, but data shows, and it's like these decisions are being made without ethical data, because there is data to support the argument, but you know, the way you're reading the data is, you know, suspect. But I love G2 Brown's comment of Journey for Justice. He said, let's not pretend like our schools were serving our students well in the first place. Some of our schools, because there are examples where schools are balanced racially and resources are there, and all students, most of the students are performing well. Special needs students get the special needs, get the special resources that they need. There's a variety of courses, AP, dual credit, you know, all kinds of resources you can find in a public school that other schools just don't serve well. Charter schools and voucher schools, oftentimes a charter school may usher you in the front door and counsel you out the back door when it comes time to test. And in my opinion, we can't talk about vouchers without talking about the public charter schools. And I say public in quotes, because they're run by non-democratically elected school boards and funded, in addition to the state funding, by other resources of billionaires and things, which I believe are the private schools' answer to reject the students that they don't want. Go to the private like public school down the street that doesn't really serve students well either. So this thing is not as complicated because the motivation is race, and we often don't talk about that, and she's exactly right. The language has been co-opted to make it appeal to the masses in a more palatable way, because you know, they're just repackaged instruments of segregation that are not serving our students, and our country is going to be weakened as a result.
Yeah, thank you both. So, okay, now the hardest question of all. What do we do? We are at a point in our country where privatization, this kind of cycle of defunding or underfunding public schools, forcing underperformance, taking away teacher autonomy, propping up these alternatives that they claim are better, like private schools and micro schools and homeschooling, and then sort of putting this cycle on repeat. And it's tough because we see this spreading across the country, and the people pushing it do not have the best interests of our kids at heart. They see dollar signs attached to our kids. What do we do? What do we do about this? How do we find ways to push back and find ways to really bring, I like your word, Dountonia, ethical and equitable public education systems that will really serve all of our kids well? What do we do? I'm asking you guys such hard questions tonight, so.
Well, I'll take a swing at that one because I think it's with us, parents for public schools, families. You mentioned, Sharon, that when you speak to people, the vast majority of them are satisfied with their schools. Mm-hmm. And so what I believe is we've got this underbelly of folks in this country who are beating up on public schools and denigrating them and pulling them down. But I believe there is a large majority that doesn't feel that way, that doesn't see it that way. And what we are pushing to do at Parents for Public Schools, in coalition with some other folks whose mission aligned with ours and who see it the way, we need to make sure that those voices are heard, that those people are pushing in support of public schools. And the other thing is we've got to elect leaders who support and believe in public education. I'm sorry, Betsy DeVos did not believe in public education. I don't know if she knew what it was. The fact is, that's a part of it. The adults in our children's lives have to fight for them, and they have to fight for their schools, and they have to fight for their quality of life. And education is such a fundamental part of the quality of life that our children should have.
Yep.
I
Thank you.
agree. I agree wholeheartedly. However, I also think we need to get more strategic about how we message and educate the parents. You know, as I'm about to graduate my last 2 children out the door, and one would think that, oh, now my advocacy is over, but it's not. We've got a whole generation of students whose education is constantly being disrupted. So we have to keep getting the message out there, even if we're preaching to the choir. So, you know, the music doesn't just stay in the choir room, it does get out and people will hopefully ask questions. But our messaging needs to be more clear and more succinct. And then making connections to the impact of this new reform of public education and what we're doing, and connecting it back to, you know, government has been, teaching of government in schools has really been gutted, but really making those connections back to, you know, the purpose of government and our place in it, because we are, you know, people, you know, so the people involvement in how our country runs. But also a strategy that I think has been echoed, and it's not my unique idea. It's our gubernatorial candidate in Indiana says that we should really be talking to our rural communities, because their schools are being consolidated and taken away, and yet their portion of the pot to fund their schools are being sent to cities to dismantle their school systems. And the boomerang effect of that is that simultaneously, those constituents who are in the state houses voting for these movements are simultaneously undermining the educational structure of their own communities. And so if we mobilize, and that's another thing, mobilizing the rural community and the urban connection, we just don't understand that that is a big link, similar to, you know, the workmen's movement of Dr. King, and you know, they don't want the rural community and the Black community to come together. So, but it's a radical, in my opinion, that strategy, because most of the legislators in my state are from rural communities. And if we mobilize, and they don't really listen when I come down there to speak to them or other people from the city, they want to hear from our constituents. And so we need to really educate and message and let them know what's happening. But yeah, mobilizing parents, mobilizing non-parents, because it's our tax dollars. It's not just a parent issue. And that's one of the messages we get out there. No, you don't send your kids to public school, but yes, it impacts you and us who have children. So really understanding that education does not exist in a vacuum. It is a community-wide issue that is connected to criminal justice reform, juvenile justice reform. It's connected to housing. It's connected to economic development. And it's not just about a school choice. It's about a community dismantling that we are systematically doing under the guise of school choice.
It all starts with education.
That's right.
It all starts with education.
Yeah, well said.
And it's, you know, I know it sounds simplistic, but it is government of, for, and by the people. And we got to believe that. And if it's for us and it's by us, we got to get in the game. I mean, that is people, and that's just not, it's all of us, because it's in all of our best interests to have strong public schools. It really is.
Okay, wow, let's leave it at that. You guys have both given us so much information and words of wisdom. I really, really appreciate you being here tonight, all of the work that you do for your communities, for public schools, with parents, with community members. I really do think it's going to take all of us talking a lot about the importance of public schools for our kids and for our communities. And Dountonia, like you said, are rural communities. That is absolutely essential in Arizona, and Saber Schools has really been focusing on rural communities in the last year, because although the voucher program negatively impacts all communities, it in an outsized way negatively impacts our rural communities, because oftentimes those communities don't have any other choice. Or if another choice moves in and skims off all of the, some students and leaves the public school in an even more difficult situation. So I think really helping parents and community members understand the vital role that the public schools play in their communities, of course, for educating their kids, but also more broadly in the community is absolutely critical and essential. So thank you both so much for joining me on a very late evening for you guys on the East Coast. Really appreciate your time and all the work that you do. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Nice meeting you, Dountonia.
Likewise.
That's great.
Thank you.
Okay.